the Old Bellamy Hotel. The Bellamy Hotel had always been one of those places that whispered secrets to anyone who dared to listen. Set on the outskirts of a small, forgotten town, the building had stood for over a century. Its towering spires loomed like the skeletal remains of some forgotten giant. Its stone facade covered in ivy, its windows shattered by time. No one in the town quite remembered when it was built, but the rumors surrounding it never ceased. I had no intention of working at the Bellamy. But after I found the listing for a night guide position, I thought, why not? I needed a job, and it seemed simple enough. Just answer a few calls, patrol the halls, make sure everything was in order until morning. At least that's what I thought when I showed up for my first shift. Mrs. Winthrop, the elderly front desk clerk, welcomed me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was old, far older than anyone in the town, and her hands trembled slightly as she handed me a brass key and a faded uniform. Her gaze was piercing, as if she were measuring me for something I wasn't yet aware of. "Welcome to the Bellamy," she said, her voice soft but oddly firm. "It's a quiet place, mostly, but there are things here you'll need to understand before you start." I shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "Things? Like what?" She studied me for a long moment, just to see her eyes narrowing as though weighing my very soul. Finally, she spoke. "There are 7 rules. Follow them and you'll make it through the night. Break them and, well, let's just say it's not pretty. The Bellamy has a way of claiming what it needs." I laughed nervously, dismissing her warning as superstition. After all, it was just an old hotel, right? I took the uniform, nodded at Mrs. Winthrop, and made my way to the back halls of the hotel. At midnight, my shift began. The first thing that struck me was how silent the Bellamy was. The thick carpet muffled my footsteps, and the dim, flickering lights created long shadows in the hallways. As I walked, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Maybe it was the smell of old wood, or the fact that the building felt like it had seen 100 years of tragedy, secrets, and loss. I was assigned to patrol the upper floors, make sure no guests were causing trouble, and, most importantly, answer the phone when it rang. The latter seemed harmless enough until I learned the first rule. Rule 1. Never answer the phone after midnight. I was told it was simple. The hotel had its own schedule, and the phone calls, particularly after midnight, were never what they seemed. I remember Mrs. Winthrop's voice echoing in my mind as I walked the halls, her warning settling in my stomach like a cold stone. The clock struck 1 a.m., and it was then that I heard the phone ring. It echoed through the empty hotel lobby, sharp and insistent. I stood frozen in the hall for a moment, my heart skipping a beat. The ringing stopped, then it started again. Against my better judgment, I made my way to the front desk. The phone sat there like a black, twisted thing waiting for me. I could feel Mrs. Winthrop's warning pressing against my chest, but curiosity got the better of me. I picked up the receiver. "Hello?" I said, my voice shaky. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then I heard a voice. It was low, raspy, and seemed to echo in a way that made my stomach churn. "You shouldn't have answered," the voice croaked. "Now you'll never leave." The phone went dead, and I jerked it away from my ear, my heart hammering in my chest. I stared at the receiver in my hands, but there was no one on the other end. The hotel was silent again, the oppressive quiet almost too much to bear. I tried to shake off the unease that crept into my bones. Maybe it was just a prank, I told myself, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Something in the way the voice spoke, like it had traveled through time itself, had unsettled me. The next rule came to mind as I paced the lobby. Rule 2, never use the number 17 in conversation or context. I had dismissed this rule as ridiculous at first, but as I walked down the hall, passing room 17, something stopped me. The door was ajar, just slightly. A cold draft slipped out, and for a moment I swore I saw a shadow moving just inside the room. I froze. The feeling was overwhelming, like something was pulling me toward it, dragging me closer. It was as if the hotel itself was coaxing me to break the rule. I took a step closer, then stopped myself. I couldn't ignore the warning. "Don't go in there," I muttered to myself, turning away quickly. I rushed down the hall, my pulse racing as I tried to ignore the whispers that seemed to creep into my mind. They were soft at first, like the rustling of a forgotten paper, but the more I resisted, the louder they became, urging me to turn around. Don't break the rules, I reminded myself. But the closer I got to the stairwell, the louder the whispers became until they were screams inside my mind. Don't leave. Don't leave. The voice was no longer just in my head. It was everywhere. The walls, the floors, the very air around me. I glanced back at room 17 and saw her standing there. A woman, pale, ghostly, with long, tangled hair and hollow eyes. She was staring at me. No, through me. Rule 3, she rasped, her voice so dry it sounded like leaves crunching. Never leave after 3 a.m. I stumbled back, the words crashing over me. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned and fled, running down the hallway and down the stairs. The air around me felt thick, suffocating. The hotel seemed to be closing in, the walls bending, the floors shifting under my feet. I wanted to scream, to break the silence, but my voice failed me. I reached the lobby, breathless, and as I looked around for any sign of escape, I realized something terrible. The front doors were locked. The same door that had opened so freely when I first entered was now sealed shut, as though the hotel had made sure I couldn't leave. Rule 4, never try to leave before 4 a.m. I backed away from the doors, terror gripping me. My eyes darted around, searching for an escape route, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows in the corners seemed to watch me, the darkness pressing in from every side. As I stood there, the clock struck 3 a.m., and I heard it, the soft, rhythmic tapping on the door. It wasn't a knock, it was a scratch, as though something was trying to claw its way inside. I turned, and there she was again, the woman from room 17. She stood in the doorway, her eyes wide and filled with something hollow. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Her mouth opened wider, impossibly wide, stretching as if it were going to consume me whole. I stumbled backward, tripping over the rug beneath me. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating. And then the whispers came again, louder now, filling the room with a haunting chant. Don't look into the mirror after midnight. Rule 5, never look into a mirror after midnight. I froze. There was a mirror on the wall, across from me. The reflection was distorted, fuzzy, twisted, but it was still there, and I couldn't look away. In the mirror, I saw myself, but not as I was. My reflection grinned back at me with a grin that didn't belong to me, stretching wider and wider until it looked more like a scream. I shut my eyes, stumbling away from it, and when I opened them again, the reflection was gone. But the woman was still there, closer now, her hands reaching toward me. I ran. The rest of the night passed in a blur of terror. The hotel seemed to stretch on forever, a maze with no escape. I lost track of the hours, the rules, the warnings. My mind was a blur of shadows and screams, each corner darker than the last. Finally, the clock struck 6 a.m. The doors opened. I didn't think twice. I ran into the morning light, gasping for breath, my heart still pounding. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the town. But as I looked back, I saw the Bellamy Hotel standing there in the distance, waiting. And I knew, deep down, that no matter how far I ran, the Bellamy would always find me. It would always want me. And one day I would return.